Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria and welcome to a special edition of Counting the Cost from here at the World Economic Forum in Davos. For 51 weeks a year, just a regular Swiss alpine town, but for this 1 week, it hosts the forum and a whole host of political, economic and business minds from all over the world. Let's say from the outset though, Davos isn't about binding agreements and concrete deals. It's about talking, it's about networking, because you've got all these people in the one place at the one time. And so in that spirit, we decided to have a bit of a chat for this week's Counting the Cost. We got together with the World Economic Forum and got together a panel of 6 world leaders, economists and CEOs for a special one-off debate called The Economic Malaise and Its Perils.
If you would just allow me first to introduce our distinguished panel today, I will start from the far left, or my far left as well. Guy Ryder is with us. He is the Director-General of the International Labour Organization. Next to him, Mohammed Najib bin Tun Abdul Razak, who is the Prime Minister of Malaysia. And to my immediate left, Jim Hagemann Snabb, who is the Chief Executive of SAP, the business software company. And then we carry on. We have the President of Iceland here, Olafur Ragnar Grimsson. Next to him, Lee Dao-ki. He's the Director of the Centre for China in the World Economy. He's also a former advisor of the People's Bank of China. And finally, Mr. Ali Babacan. He's the Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey in charge of the economy. Just a round of applause for our guests, please. Wouldn't mind. Absolutely thrilled to have you all here, gentlemen. Thank you for your time. I think really the biggest focus of our discussion today has to be employment or unemployment, whichever way you'd like to look at it, because it is, I think, the biggest indicator of the health of a country. You know, markets aren't doing bad these days, but if you haven't got a job, that doesn't really mean anything. And there's timing here, of course, as we've been here at the World Economic Forum this week, and we heard as an example Spain's employment numbers come out. So I might start down with Guy Ryder from the International Labour Organization. 55% youth unemployment in Spain. 26% unemployment across the board there. It just keeps getting worse. And the thing which worries me when I look at this, and I'm sure it worries a lot of people, is that there doesn't seem to be a bend in the road there. You can't see when this could possibly get better. Your initial thoughts on just how bad this unemployment crisis is?
Well, I think in the case of Spain, you've hit the nail on the head. The figures that came out this week are absolutely appalling. And you're quite right to say that there's no apparent turn in the road. You can't see the upturn. But I think whilst we're all focused, and understandably so, on Spain right now, we're faced with a continuing global jobs crisis. This is the point. I think many of us are warming up to the idea that there is a recovery in financial circumstances. As you've said, the intensity of the financial crisis does appear to be receding. But the problem is that job markets are giving different signals. We lost over 4 million jobs, 4 million more unemployed in 2012. For 2013, it's another 5 million, and it carries on. The horizon is not in sight. So I think policymakers need to take very, very quick action, full advantage of the space that perhaps financial improvement offers us to tackle the jobs crisis.
Well, I hate to state the obvious here, but it's all self-perpetuating here. If you haven't got a job, or if there aren't jobs, the economy can't grow. If the economy can't grow, it can't create jobs. And if jobs, and it goes on and on and on. Again, I go back to my point here that the desperation of people, if we bring it back to people every time, they can't see an end to this. Yeah.
Well, that simple logic that you've set out was a logic that wasn't apparent to policymakers when we started applying austerity in Europe to tackle the financial crisis. If you'd have said that or been listened to 3 or 4 years ago, perhaps we might have been able to avoid some of the excesses of the job crisis right now, which, as you're indicating, is perhaps a definition. It's not the only element of the economic malaise that we face, but it's absolutely the quintessential centre of it all.
Prime Minister, I feel we could spend the whole time talking about Europe if we're not careful. I would like to quickly get to Asia and actually tell me how bad or in fact how good it is there in comparison.
Well, if there is one area, Kamal, which is a ray of hope, that's basically ASEAN and East Asia. If you go there, there's an air of optimism. You know, people believe that things are actually getting better. In the case of Malaysia, we are at the heart of ASEAN. And there's full employment in Malaysia. 3.1% unemployment, which is considered full employment.
What do you do differently there?
I think we realized that, coming out of the Asian financial crisis in 1997, we recovered. We were growing, but we were growing slowly, at 3-4%. And we were in the so-called middle income trap. We needed to have a breakout strategy. So we came up with a new economic model. And that was the key to it. A planned transformation in a very comprehensive way. And that created huge jump in private investment. And that's really the engine of growth. I mean, you talk about creating jobs. It's really revitalizing the private sector, because the private sector will provide jobs. And as a result, we've created more than 300,000 new jobs in just a few years. So things are looking up, and we've proven that you can actually do it.
Lee Dao-Ki, why don't I bring you in whilst we're talking Asia? China is a different sort of kettle of fish, if I can put it that way. It is such a huge economy. We still consider it an emerging economy, however. And the fact is, and I don't know if I can so much apply this to employment, but certainly economy-wise there is a slowdown. That can't be denied now. There is a slowdown there. How does China avoid any sort of real slide?
Well, to begin with, I really want to emphasize one thing, that despite all the problems in Europe, in the US, in some parts of the Middle East, we should keep our big picture. The big picture today is very simple. That is, never before in history did we observe billions of people who were very poor now suddenly find ways to improve their lives, right? In China, in India, in other parts of emerging markets, and also technology. Technology is doing a revolution. I call it quiet revolution, right? So many smartphones are being used by poor people, right? And SAP.
You said poor people, and
including, of course, rich people like you, right? SAP is doing wonderful jobs, right? Using cloud calculation, cloud computing, using what do you call it, memory calculation, right? Enabling people whose minds were idling many years ago, now actively participating in decisions of this world. Now back to China. China is slowing down, but I call it healthy slowing down, because in the past 5 years, the GDP growth rate has been over 10%. That is not sustainable.
Never sustainable, exactly.
Not sustainable. Now we're down to the range of 7 to 8%, close to 8. That is much healthier. And most important, talking about the jobs. Despite it slowing down to 7.8% last year GDP, China last year had almost a record year of creating new jobs. 12 million new jobs were created. Usually, if there are 9 billion jobs created, we're happy as economists. Last year, 12 million jobs. What's going on? I think very simple. The private sector is now becoming more active in the service sector. Service is the area creating jobs. Manufacturing per se is not a big spot of creating jobs. Look, in the US, manufacturing only accounts for 11% of jobs. Service, including various supporting services for high-tech companies, that's the area of creating jobs. And private investments in this area they are most important.
Okay, since you've talked about technology and you mentioned Jim, I'll bring in Jim Starr from SAP. Do you agree with that? A sort of quiet technological revolution which could have a very big impact on jobs, quite simply?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the last 20 years, we've seen companies and countries focus on productivity improvement, standardization of processes. That's how we got successful. And also we've seen a labor arbitrage movement which created a lot of jobs, in particular in manufacturing and services in Asia. Now, you can only go so far with labor arbitrage. This will always level out eventually. And I think what we're standing right in front of now is the next wave, which is a technological-driven revolution. It's partly, as Mr. Dao-Qui said, it's about, for the first time in history, we have instant access to billions of people. This technology is affordable. We will now start a revolution of automating jobs rather than having labor arbitrage. And that's why I think the growth rates in a traditional sense will go down also in Asia. But it fuels a new opportunity where I don't think it's about scaling large companies. It's about enabling people to take advantage of the fact that they can reach people everywhere in the world. They can create their own jobs, their own companies, and we need to foster these entrepreneurs.
And what I want to touch on, we won't do it just now because I've got a couple more questions, but is the idea, and it's the reverse of what you've said, that technology can actually take away jobs. I'm going to come back to that one in a moment in time. Mr. President, I wonder if I could bring you in here. I did a little bit of research and looked at some unemployment numbers for Iceland. End of 2008, you had around 1% unemployment, and then when things got bad, it got really bad, and it got really bad really fast. We're talking 8% unemployment in a matter of months, 6 months perhaps. As a leader, tell me and tell our audience how you confront that. Because this is what other countries in Europe and around the world are looking at. They're looking at this number and they're thinking, how on earth do I deal with that?
I think the most important aspect of our solution after the crisis was that we were fortunate enough to realize that this was not just an economic crisis. This was a profound social and democratic crisis. It was more about people than about banks. And I think the big problem with the European debate today is it has been framed in such a way that it's primarily about financial markets rather than about people. So we let the banks fail. We didn't bail them out. We devalued the currency. We introduced currency controls. We went against the established orthodoxies of the prevailing IMF-led Western policymaking, which was attempt to force on Asia more than 20 years ago. And I think it should be a wake-up call for everybody in those financial institutions that Iceland now, 4 years later, as we were at the beginning of the crisis, exhibit number one in terms of a failed country, we are now exhibit number one in terms of recovery and success. Because we went against the policy ideology which puts banks and financial markets up front and treats people and unemployment somewhat as a secondary priority. So now, 4 years later, we have 3% annual growth. It's low by Chinese standard, but it's pretty successful compared to most European countries. The unemployment now is 5%. Yes. Which is perhaps higher than we would like it to be given how it was for a number of decades, but is a colossal improvement compared to the state of affairs in the first year after the crisis. And I've often said, why are banks treated as the holy churches of the modern economy? What's the difference between a telecommunication company and a bank in terms of providing social well-being and healthcare?
Turkey, and I'm making a horrible generalization here, but it's not a country we hear about much in the economic crisis. We were discussing before the panel how you're bridged between Europe and Middle East and dealing with so many different things. How have your policies there impacted? How have they kept things in check in Turkey or otherwise?
Well, for every stage of the crisis since 2007, 2008, what we have done in Turkey is putting confidence at the center of our policies. Whatever is needed to secure confidence with our consumers, with our corporates, and with our financial sector, we have done that. But growth came from private sector activity. Private consumption, private investments. Government spending, in our case, had no contribution to our growth. This high growth, together with targeted labor market policies, helped us also to generate jobs. What we have done, for example, was for those who lost their jobs for the last 6 months, we reduced the cost of entry for them to get back to the job market. We simply, as the Treasury, paid the Social Security premium for those who have been unemployed for the last 6 months, if they got a job. For young people up to age 29, and also for women, if they were getting into the job market for the very first time, we again paid the Social Security as the Treasury, so that the employer didn't have to bear the costs. We started vocational training programs. Hundreds of thousands of young people got into those programs. And for every day, that they joined the program, we paid them about $10 or so that they can cover the cost of transport and lunch and so forth. For vocational training...
So that's good. So I'll interrupt you there just quickly. That to me sounds like the kind of practical thing. Like,
exactly.
Because a young person might go, I can't afford to catch the bus, or I can't, those are the things which mount up. Those are the types of, when we talk about policy, an actual practical thing which the person can see. They're not just hearing a politician talk about it.
Exactly. And also, for example, for practical training, if a young guy got a job, for the practical training period in a factory, we paid the salary for the first 6 to 9 months, so that employer and employee gets to know each other, and if the employer likes him or her, they can continue. Then people ask me, okay, what about investments? With austerity, how did you do the infrastructure investments? And the answer to that was PPP. We involved our private sector heavily for the required investment projects. We are now building a 7 billion euro airport in Istanbul, a $3 billion bridge, another $7 billion tollway bridge system. These are all built by private sector, operated by private sector. We just put the rules and monitor.
Go and do
we don't spend government money for major infrastructure projects anymore.
Just checking my notes here, we did actually call this debate the economic malaise. I don't know if anyone else knows. I'm hearing good positive talk. This is good. The thing I do want to do at this point, gentlemen, is really, you've all explained very well, excuse me, from the perspective of business or government. I want us to flip it around and look at it from the perspective of the people who don't have jobs out there, and this idea of, an employer's worth. Jim, I might start with you. You've got, if I'm correct, 60,000 employees across SAP. A good employer should always say that his or her people are his or her best asset. How do you stay true to that when companies are having to cut back? And the point I made earlier, that technology, whilst it helps us, it can start replacing jobs, especially if a company has to cut back. If it can find a machine that can do the job of 2 people, well, I was going to say brilliant, but in these times it is for them.
Well, it's interesting. A couple of years ago, we had the debate, the war for talent. And now we find ourselves in a situation with an increasing unemployment. And most importantly, my biggest concern is it's an unemployment among young people. Now, what is it that it takes for a company like SAP to be successful or countries to be successful? It is fundamentally innovation. And through innovation comes better ways to manage resources and create growth opportunity. And therefore, I do believe that in all industries, it is still true that it is about the talent that you can employ and the opportunities that you give this talent. We have a problem in Europe alone where we see an IT industry rapidly growing, yet we have an increasing unemployment. That doesn't make sense. Here's a skill match problem, and we need to do something. We can't just sit and wait for politicians to solve that problem. What we're doing is, first of all, we're recognizing our own people is important by constantly using a lot of effort to reskill them for the new world. The mobility, the in-memory computing, cloud computing, these are all new technologies that came along the last few years. And we are reskilling our workforce to be the best of that in our industry.
So you're retraining for the right areas. Guy,
Yes.
Can I just bring you in at this point? As someone from the International Labour Organization, do you feel, I mean, that's great if we're getting people into the right jobs, but you're going to have a ton of people who've lost their jobs and won't have the right skills to go back. Do you fear that when we do finally turn the corner and things start improving, that companies won't necessarily start hiring people back? They won't rehire necessarily because they will have found new ways to operate under difficult conditions, and they might say, well, look, we just have to carry on as we are.
It's traditional, I think, to blame the educational system for creating a mismatch between what is needed and what exists. My view on that is, of course, you do need to look at educational systems, but I think there is also a role for business. I think it's a little too easy, I'm not suggesting that's what's being said here, for a business to say, look, we can't get the skills we need. Traditionally, enterprises have a certain part of the responsibility in training people and creating those skills. And what I'm hearing here in Davos is actually a little bit of a comeback, and the Turkish example is a good one. The policies at work are policies that actually mix together formal education and work experience. Now, that old idea of apprenticeship, which my father's generation had access to, I never did in my country. I think we've got to sort of dig that one out of history.
Well, give people
and
skills.
Start working on it.
And education is valuable, of course, but if an employer sees someone with experience, they're probably going to go to that first, are they not?
In our case, we built them by two elements: vocational training and practical training. Vocational training for people to learn about new jobs, and practical training to be physically in the factories, in the workshops, to get learning about the job itself. And we have been covering the costs of most of those bridging process. And believe me, the cost is so minimal. It is so efficient. The money that you spend for vocational training, or even the salaries for the practical training period, is so minimal compared to the amount of jobs that you create by doing so.
Well, I guess there's one premise, that is people who get trained should have the right incentives. In other words, they should find it better for them in the future to join your training program rather than staying at home and collecting basic benefits from unemployment. That is a key.
That's why we paid them to attend the vocational training programs. They don't
Give them
pay
an
us.
incentive,
We
exactly.
paid them so that they don't worry about cost of traveling or lunch or whatsoever. And it worked out.
So that leads me to the European situation. In Europe, right? In Europe, in my experience, they oftentimes have too comfortable welfare. The welfare system is too comfortable, so that even if you offer them training programs, people may not join the training program. So I think Europe and Asia perhaps are having opposite problems.
Well, with all due respect, I don't think the cure is to cut down on the welfare program and bring Europe down to the level of welfare provided in many of the Asian countries. And the proof of that point I'm putting forward is to look at the Nordic countries. The Nordic countries have one of the highest levels of welfare payments in the world. They have an extraordinary system of programs like the ones being described in Turkey. But they are also one of the most competitive market economies that you can find. And if you examine the state of the Nordic economies following the financial crisis, they are the part of Europe that is doing best in terms of general performance.
Mr. President,
but I think the lesson we can learn from Asia, if I may just add in one sentence, the lessons we can learn from Asia is to give young people this can-do spirit, because I find the striking contrast between young people in Europe and in Asia is this can-do spirit, that we can actually make a big difference.
Prime Minister, the can-do spirit.
Yes, we actually, I met a coincidence. We have this slogan in Malaysia called Malaysia Boleh, which literally means can do. And that is the spirit that we have in Malaysia. We have a great deal of optimism. I'd like to make the distinction between having a welfare state, which we think is not the model for Asia. I think the model for Asia will be very pro-growth, very pro-business, investor-friendly, business-friendly policies, and at the same time, a good social safety net, which is fundamentally different from a welfare state. And in Malaysia, we have instituted social safety nets. You see, why we disagreed with IMF vehemently, maybe it was the old IMF, the Asian financial crisis, because...
But like Iceland, you were right, weren't you?
They were telling us, yes, take our prescription, but pay the political and social cost. So we came up with our own, model of recovery, which was capital controls, and people know about it. It worked.
What was that phrase again that you said?
Which one?
Malaysia can do.
Malaysia Boleh.
Right. I think
that's a Malay word.
I think that's better than Malaysia Truly Asia, to be honest with you.
That's for different purposes.
Ladies and gentlemen, and panelists here, look, thank you so much. It's just been such an enlightening conversation. As I said, we called it the economic malaise. I'm not sure that was the right title in the end. But
it's not supposed to M-A-L-A-Y.
M-A-L-A-Y-S, there you go. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our panel, please.
Yep, a fascinating debate it was, and really one of the beauties of Davos, other than the stunning scenery around here, is that you can actually talk to such a range of big players in the one room at the one time. That's it for our special edition of Counting the Cost. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team here in Davos. Thanks for joining us. We will see you back in the warmth of the Doha studio again next week.